The sound of the man's cane echoed in the hallway as I escorted him through one of the many tunnels that run underneath the hospital complex where I work. "Do we need to slow down?" I asked. "No," he said. "I am a veteran. I can do it." I nodded. "Thank you for your service, sir," I said. And he stopped walking then. He lowered his head ever so slightly. "Thank you," he said. I wondered what he had seen during his military service. I imagined him flat on his stomach in the jungle, pictured him smiling with his fellow soldiers in a photo, wondered how many of them did not return. I envisioned his homecoming. How was he welcomed? I thought about what our country had asked him to sacrifice, and I wondered whether pain was now his constant companion. I did not speak any of my wonderings aloud that day, and I have not and likely will not see him again. But the sound of his cane and the force of his pride and the gratitude I felt at the opportunity to, in the most minuscule way, serve a man who had served his country have stayed with me since our brief encounter. I am thinking of him this weekend. Memorial Day is enshrined in the American calendar as the day we set aside to honor those who have died while serving our nation's armed forces. Let us also not forget this weekend those whose lives are forever changed by war. Let us not forget military families, veterans, and the civilians who face the toll of violent conflict as well. I invite you to join me now for an exploration of the origins of this tradition of memorializing our war dead and reflect together on what it means to look back on suffering and sacrifice. We will take in the impacts of war, but also on this centennial anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, we will look at the impacts of centuries of structural racism and racist violence. And finally, we will consider the sacrifices that so many have made during the past year and a half of fighting this pandemic and how we begin to move forward. We are inspired in our quest this morning by the Sankofa bird, the Akan symbol from Ghana, whose literal translation is, "It is not taboo to fetch what is at risk of being left behind." The Sankofa bird reminds us to go back and fetch it, to look back at our past and bring the lessons of what has been into the present in order to forge a new way into the future. Before we continue, another disclaimer. I want to say a word about what it means to look together at hard things. Perhaps it is because I was raised by an historian. Perhaps it is part of the job description of an oncology chaplain, but I have realized that I have a strong impulse not to shy away from the painful or the ugly, but to cup it in my hands and to look it in the face and to glean what we can learn from it. I believe that when we do this challenging work within a beloved community such as this one, when we brave the ugly and painful realities of life together, when we comfort each other when we are frightened, we truly can birth something new into existence. And I understand that sometimes the ugly simply feels too ugly, and the painful can feel dangerously painful, can be dangerously painful. I also know that our hearts have been broken open again and again this past year, and so this morning, if you need to care for yourself in a different way than listening to my words, I invite you to offer your spirit and your body what it is they need. So I want to tell you now that I am going to take us to a Civil War battlefield where formerly enslaved people marked the first Memorial Day. I am going to take us to Tulsa, Oklahoma, where 100 years ago this weekend a white mob destroyed a black community. I'm going to talk about the casualties of war and take us to Iraq and Afghanistan and Palestine and Israel and finally into the COVID ICUs. And I promise you that I will not leave you in any of those places. We will look back like Lot's wife, immortalized in Scripture and brought to life in Natalie Diaz's poem. We will look together at suffering. We will honor sacrifice and pay homage to heroes. And we will envision new models of service, new models of empowerment and care and tenderness. Together, we will look forward towards a hopeful future. That is where we are going. And again, I honor your choice as to whether you would like to undertake this journey with me this morning. Let us begin. In Charleston, South Carolina, where in May of the year 1865, shortly after the end of the Civil War, 10,000 formerly enslaved people gathered at a racetrack to commemorate the sacrifice of Union soldiers who died there as prisoners of the Confederate Army. They sang songs, hymns, the children laid flowers, the preachers read from Scripture, members of Black Army regiments marched solemnly around the track in salute. The event, now considered one of the first Memorial Day celebrations, was erased from the formal record. It became a whisper of a story told by Black grandparents, dismissed as legend and forgotten to history until the mid-1990s. And when historians finally began to uncover it, the descendants of the children who were there that day emerged, telling the stories they had heard their whole lives. They bore witness once again to the ultimate sacrifice Union soldiers had made in the cause of freedom and to the grace-filled homage paid to them by those who were freed. When I learned of this story, I thought about how many stories like it have been lost, systematically erased from the official historical record. It is a record most often kept in the interest of those in power, those who have benefited from the disempowerment of people of color and women, queer people, poor people, and others who face oppression. It is a record kept by those who foster and profit from division among us, from the whitewashing of our past and our present, from the gaslighting of those who witness injustice and violence with their own eyes and bear its burdens in their bodies. Official histories are kept by those who demand the ultimate sacrifice not only in lives, but with blind allegiance as well. When we erase history, when we deny memory, when we intentionally forget the devastating impact of hatred and violence, of war and division and demonization, then we are doomed to repeat these things all over again and again. Last week, Mrs. Viola Ford Fletcher, age 107, testified before Congress about her experiences during the days and nights of May 31st and June 1st, 1921. Over the course of those 2 days, a white mob murdered and injured hundreds, if not thousands, of Black residents and looted and burned businesses and homes and churches in the thriving Greenwood neighborhood of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Over 300 lives were lost, taken, and millions of dollars of damage was done. And the destruction has been compounded in the century since. Mrs. Fletcher described for Congress and for history her vivid memories of the massacre. Her memories reflect the scenes of destruction in Diaz's poem I read this morning. "I have lived through the massacre every day," Viola Fletcher said. "Our country may forget this history, but I cannot," she said. "I will not." Look back, she essentially entreated the committee. Acknowledge what happened to us. Do not continue the injustice, not only of the events of those days in Tulsa in 1921, but of every night since, as the white community systematically purged the record of the race massacre, told survivors it never happened, blamed Black folks for the destruction and devastation, and sought to bury not only the bodies, but the memory of what happened. But memories are like seeds. You can bury them, you can cover them up, you can sink them into darkness, but still they will bloom. Buried truths burrow their way up through history, blossoming into the present. Truth, though, truth is a shapeshifter. It bends and stretches. It changes colors in the light depending on who is holding it and who is beholding it, who is wielding it like a weapon or like a shield. We have all watched in horror in recent weeks as bombs flew and hundreds of people died in Palestine and a dozen people died in Israel, and all of them caught in the crossfire of an ancient conflict. Like you, perhaps I prayed fervently for peace as I read the devastating stories of Palestinian parents burying their children, and I heard firsthand the experiences of friends in Israel pulling their children out of bed in the middle of the night to take shelter. In my mind, I wrapped both nations, yes, nations, in ribbons of care and compassion and prayed that the hearts of their leaders might somehow be touched by the suffering of their people. Perhaps those prayers were futile. Indeed, the images of this most recent war in the Middle East, added to the news of the violent aftermath of recent troop withdrawals in Afghanistan, have my mind winging to George Orwell's 1984, to his descriptions of continuous war as a means to control the production and consumption of goods and the lives and the deaths of the world's population. So let us stop here for a moment and let us look back at the history of endless wars. The modern celebration of Memorial Day began in earnest after World War I, the war to end all wars, they called it, in which 117,000 American soldiers and 10 million military personnel around the world died. The total casualties of World War I, military and civilian, by some accounts, total 40 million people. In all the wars of the 20th century, scholars believe that at least 108 million people were killed. Deaths in the conflicts during the first 20 years of the 21st century are challenging to quantify as yet. We do know that over 7,000 U.S. service members and over 8,000 military contractors have died in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs reports that since 2001, at least 800,000 people have been killed by direct war violence in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, and Pakistan. More than 310,000 of them were civilians. The number of people who have been wounded or have fallen ill as a result of the conflicts is far higher, the Institute reports, as is the number of civilians who have died indirectly as a result of the destruction of hospitals and infrastructure and environmental contamination, among other war-related problems. Look back at burned-out streets and billowing smoke, at people thirsty and afraid. Hear our neighbors of every hue and every tongue, begging our names. Let us look back now from far enough that we, like the woman in the poem, can hold the cities, hold the nations, and the world entire in the palms of our hands, such that we could blow them like a kiss. Natalie Diaz's poem is truly a marvel. Diaz is a queer indigenous poet who turns the story of Lot's wife from the book of Genesis on its head. She humanizes not only the unnamed woman, but the people of the city she and her family are fleeing, the city that God's angels are said to have destroyed. Diaz upends the text that has been used to demonize and persecute LGBTQ people and reimagines Lot's wife as a witness, not just to the destruction of the city of Sodom, but she brings it into the 21st century. She makes her a witness to the timeless devastation of violence begat by hatred. And she invites us too not to look away. But the magnitude of the wounds of war and violence are hard to bear. We can add up numbers, but especially over the past year, we have become too accustomed to numbers divorced from names. The truth is that each life lost in war, in violence, military, civilian, adult, child, each life is a story. Each life is a sacrifice. During the past 15 months, we have waged a different kind of war. Over 3 million people around the world have now died of COVID-19, and in reality, that number is certainly higher than the official tallies. Nearly 600,000 American lives have been lost. At the beginning of the pandemic, we did not have enough personal protective equipment for healthcare workers, and we asked them, we required them to place themselves in mortal danger, to run into the burning buildings that were intensive care units full of COVID-positive patients. We asked them to sacrifice everything. Many of them did. More than 3,600 American healthcare workers died in the first year of the pandemic. We ask the same of teachers and restaurant workers, grocery workers and flight attendants, meat packers and factory workers, farm workers and other laborers. We demanded that people put themselves in harm's way for the sake of others, for the sake of the economy, even for the sake of propagating the lie that everything was fine. These asks, these demands are reminiscent of what our nation has asked of our military personnel and their families for centuries. Just like the boy in the original telling of Shel Silverstein's The Giving Tree, we asked for their apples and then for their branches. We asked for their trunks, and in the end, we sat on their stumps. So let us look back now then with deep gratitude. Let us honor the untold sacrifices, the lives lost and the lives that will never be the same. Let us look back in order to consider how we move forward, not forgetting but remembering, not reliving but learning and changing. Let us envision how we can empower people to offer their gifts, their work, their resources with dignity and survive. And should they offer the ultimate sacrifice, let us envision how we can better care for their beloveds and their descendants. Let us envision communities and employers and a society that honors a boundaried no. And let us consider how we, in the positions of power that we hold, as employers and consumers, as parents and alumni, as constituents and voters, and as members of a congregation, how we honor the inherent worth and dignity of those who serve us, those who care for us and protect us and feed our bodies, our minds, and yes, our spirits. Let us not shy away from the ugly and the painful in our history, in our collective memory, or in our present lives. We have to look back. We have to look back in order to bring forward the lessons, formulate the policies, write the legislation, the guidelines, the rubrics that enable us to do better, to be better. Because as a people and as a nation and as a world, we can care for each other with more compassion. We can honor each other with more reverence. And in so doing, we will honor ourselves. And we will honor that powerful love that will never let us go. May it be so.